The automatic doors of JFK International Airport slid open, and a rush of icy wind slapped against Ethan Carter's face. The cold bit through his coat, seeping into his bones, yet it was nothing compared to the frost that had settled inside him for years. 30 years. That was how long it had been since he was abandoned. Not in Seoul, not in some orphanage overseas, but right here in America. Somewhere in this country, a woman had given birth to him and decided he wasn't worth keeping. He didn't know where. He didn't know why. What he did know was that he had been adopted in Los Angeles, raised in the sun-drenched sprawl of California, in a house that was supposed to be a home but had never felt like one. And now, after 3 decades, he had returned, not to reminisce, not to reconnect, but to find her, and to make her suffer. His fingers tightened around the handle of his carry-on bag as he stepped onto the curb outside the arrivals terminal. Around him, the airport buzzed with movement, families embracing, businessmen checking their watches, cab drivers shouting for fares. People arriving. People leaving. People with destinations and expectations. Ethan had neither. His only purpose for being here was to track down the woman who had left him behind. A sleek black Cadillac waited by the curb, engine purring softly. As he approached, the driver stepped out and nodded respectfully. "Welcome to New York, Mr. Carter." "Where to?" "The hotel," Ethan replied coolly, climbing into the back seat. The car pulled away, merging into the endless river of headlights and taillights streaming down the freeway. Ethan rested his elbow on the window frame, watching the city unfurl before him. New York was a beast of steel and glass, a place that never slept, never stopped moving. It was nothing like LA. In Los Angeles, the sun set in slow, golden hues, painting the sky in warmth even as the night fell. The ocean shimmered in the distance, palm trees swayed lazily, and the world moved at a pace that, despite everything, sometimes felt too easy. But in New York? New York was sharp edges and cold hearts, just the way he wanted it. As the car weaved through the streets of Manhattan, his phone vibrated. He pulled it from his pocket and glanced at the screen. A new email. Subject: Location report, Susan Carter. His breath came slower as he clicked the message open. Name: Susan Carter. Age: 57. Current residence: small one-bedroom apartment, Brooklyn, New York. Occupation: waitress at a local diner, Mama's Kitchen. Financial status: severe debt, history of delinquent payments. Medical records: kidney donation recorded in 1996. Legal record: no criminal charges, but history of financial lawsuits. Ethan exhaled slowly. A diner waitress? In Brooklyn? This wasn't what he had expected. When he imagined her, he saw someone thriving, someone who had walked away from him and never looked back. He had pictured her with another family, a comfortable life, maybe even children she had actually wanted. But this was pathetic. A small part of him felt an unexpected twist of disappointment. But why? He shook the thought away. It didn't matter how she lived. What mattered was that she had gone on living without him, and that was something he was here to correct. He put his phone down, staring out at the city as the car pulled up to the hotel. The streets shimmered under the neon glow of storefronts and billboards. The world outside buzzed with energy, yet inside, all Ethan felt was a strange, numbing stillness. He wasn't here to feel. He was here to end this. The next morning, Ethan Carter sat in the back of another black sedan, this time heading toward Brooklyn. The towering skyline of Manhattan slowly faded in the rearview mirror, replaced by the older, grittier streets of the outer boroughs. The further they drove, the more cracks appeared in the sidewalks, the more faded the storefronts became. This was her world, not some upper-class suburb. Not a house with a white picket fence. A one-bedroom apartment in a rundown neighborhood. He glanced down at his phone, rereading the report from his assistant. The words felt surreal. Kidney donation. Medical debt. Years of struggling. It was almost tragic. Almost. "We're here, sir," the driver announced. Ethan looked up. The diner was smaller than he had expected. "Mama's Kitchen" was printed in faded red letters above the entrance. The windows were clouded with grease and time, the door handle worn from years of use. Inside, he could see the silhouettes of a few customers, mostly older men hunched over their coffee cups, a couple of blue-collar workers eating their breakfast before heading to work. It was a world away from the sleek offices and high-end restaurants Ethan was used to. He stepped out of the car, adjusting the cuffs of his jacket before pushing open the diner door. A bell jingled overhead, and the smell of frying bacon and burnt coffee filled the air. The waitress behind the counter didn't look up at first, but Ethan recognized her immediately. Susan Carter. She was older than in the photos, her hair streaked with gray, pulled back into a loose ponytail. Her face was lined, her hands rough from years of work. She moved with a quiet efficiency, wiping down a table, balancing plates on her arm. For 30 years, he had imagined this moment. And now, she was standing right there. But she didn't recognize him. She walked toward his table, a notepad in hand. "Morning, hon. What can I get you?" Ethan let the words sink in. Honorable, a casual, friendly term. Spoken to a stranger. His lips curled into a smirk. "What do you recommend?" She sighed, tucking a stray piece of hair behind her ear. "Well, the pancakes are decent. Coffee strong. But if you're looking for something that won't kill your arteries, maybe try the oatmeal." "I'll take the pancakes." "Sure thing." She jotted it down and turned away. Ethan exhaled. She had no idea. She had no idea who he was. 30 years. 30 goddamn years. And she looked at him like he was just another customer. His hands tightened under the table, nails pressing into his palm. She brought the plate out a few minutes later, setting it down in front of him. "Here you go. Syrup's on the side." Ethan stared at the food. He wasn't hungry. He hadn't come here to eat. "You work here long?" he asked casually, picking up his fork. Susan hesitated, shifting the coffee pot in her hands. "A few years." "You like it?" A humorless chuckle escaped her lips. "It's a job." He took a bite of the pancakes. They were too sweet, too soft. Like everything else about this morning, they felt wrong. "You always live in Brooklyn?" This time, she frowned. Suspicion. "Good. Listen, if you need directions or something, there's a map by the door," she said, eyeing him carefully. "No need," Ethan said, wiping his mouth with a napkin. He leaned forward slightly, lowering his voice just enough for only her to hear. "I know exactly where I'm supposed to be, Mom." Silence. For a second, the entire world seemed to stop. Susan Carter stood frozen, the coffee pot trembling in her grip. Then, the pot slipped from her hands and shattered against the floor. The entire diner turned to look. Her breathing became erratic, her hands shaking as she stared at him, eyes wide in horror. She knew. She knew exactly who he was. Ethan slowly leaned back in his chair, watching the realization wash over her. What did you just say?" she whispered. "You heard me." Susan's lips parted, but no words came out. Her chest rose and fell in rapid, uneven breaths. She reached for the counter, steadying herself, her face pale as a ghost. Ethan let the silence stretch, let the weight of it crush the space between them. 30 years, he said softly. "That's how long it took for me to find you." Tears welled up in her eyes. I didn't know." "Save it." Ethan cut in coldly. He wasn't here for apologies. Her eyes darted around the room, then back to him. I have to. She turned abruptly and rushed toward the kitchen door. But Ethan wasn't about to let her escape. Ethan didn't hesitate. As Susan Carter turned to flee, he was already out of his chair. The kitchen door swung shut behind her, but he shoved it open without breaking stride. The back of the diner was small, just a cramped prep area with steel countertops, a rattling fridge, and a sink full of dishes. Steam hissed from the grill where another cook, a heavy-set man with a cigarette hanging from his lips, flipped bacon. Susan was against the far wall, gripping the counter with white-knuckled hands, her breathing ragged. She looked cornered.
Trapped. Good.
Ethan shut the door behind him. Running away again, Mom? His voice was quiet, but every syllable cut like a blade. Susan flinched, pressing her hands to her face, as if she could block out the truth. I wasn't running. No. Ethan crossed his arms, tilting his head, because that's exactly what it looked like. The cook glanced between them, sensing the tension. Hey, lady, you all right? Susan swallowed hard. I need a minute. The cook shrugged, clearly deciding this wasn't his business. He grabbed his pack of cigarettes from the counter and slipped out the back door. Now it was just the two of them. Ethan took a slow step forward, watching her every move. 30 years. He let the words hang between them. And you never looked for me. Susan squeezed her eyes shut. Ethan. She said his name like it hurt, like it burned on her tongue. So you do remember me. He let out a low, humorless chuckle. That's a relief. Because I wasn't sure if I was just some nameless mistake you forgot about.
No.
Her voice cracked. I never forgot. Ethan's jaw tightened. You should have. She sucked in a shaky breath. I thought about you every single day. He let out a sharp laugh, shaking his head.
Right.
Sure you did. Susan looked at him desperately, her eyes shimmering with unshed tears. I mean it. There wasn't a day that went by that I didn't. Didn't what? His voice turned cold. Didn't wonder if I was alive? Didn't feel guilty? Susan's lip trembled. I didn't have a choice. Ethan's hands clenched into fists. Bullshit. She flinched at the venom in his voice. You think I'm stupid? He stepped closer, forcing her to look at him. You left me, threw me away like I was nothing, like I didn't matter. And now you want to stand here and pretend you didn't have a choice. I didn't, she choked out. For the first time, her voice wasn't just breaking, it was shattering. Ethan stilled. Susan pressed a hand to her chest, as if trying to keep herself together. I was young. I was alone. I was broke. Her voice wavered. You have no idea what I went through. Ethan scoffed. Oh, I'm sorry. Was it hard for you? Was abandoning me difficult? I didn't abandon you. The words exploded from her, raw and unfiltered. Ethan froze. Then what do you call it? He demanded. Susan's entire body was trembling now. I was sick. Her voice dropped to a whisper. And you were sick, too. Ethan's brows furrowed. What? She looked down, pressing the heel of her palm against her forehead. You were born premature. Your kidneys were failing. Ethan's stomach twisted. And she exhaled shakily. And I couldn't afford your medical bills. Silence. Ethan stared at her. So he swallowed. You gave me away? Susan shook her head, her voice barely a breath. I sold my kidney. The world tilted. Ethan took a step back, as if the air had been knocked from his lungs. What? She met his eyes, and for the first time, he saw something he hadn't expected. Regret. Real, raw, soul-crushing regret. I thought it would be enough, she whispered. But it wasn't. I was drowning in debt, and they told me the only way you'd survive was if you were placed in foster care or adopted by a family who could afford the treatment. Ethan couldn't breathe. You're lying. I'm not. Her voice was hollow. I fought for you. I did everything I could. But in the end, I lost. He wanted to deny it. He wanted to scream at her, tell her that she was a liar, that she was making excuses. But something about the way she said it, about the way she looked at him, broken and exhausted, made him hesitate. Could it be true? Could she have tried? Why didn't you come back for me? His voice was hoarse. Susan let out a quiet, bitter laugh. Because I couldn't even take care of myself. Ethan swallowed the lump in his throat. He had spent 30 years hating her. 30 years believing that she had thrown him away without a second thought.
But now?
Now he didn't know what to think. Ethan stood frozen in the small, suffocating space of the diner's back kitchen. The air felt too thick, the smell of grease and old coffee clinging to his skin. He had spent his entire life preparing for this moment, for revenge. But now, standing here, staring at the woman who had haunted his nightmares and fueled his ambition, he felt something else entirely.
Doubt.
You expect me to believe this? His voice came out hoarse, but sharp. Susan didn't flinch. It's the truth, she whispered. I sold my kidney to pay for your medical bills. I fought to keep you. But the debt, the hospital, the system. I was drowning, Ethan. His jaw clenched, hands curling into fists at his sides. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. She was supposed to beg. She was supposed to fall to her knees and plead for his forgiveness. She wasn't supposed to be the one with nothing left to lose. And you never thought to find me? His voice was laced with quiet fury. Never thought I deserved an explanation? Susan looked away, staring down at the cracked linoleum floor beneath their feet. I tried, she admitted, for years. But you were gone. Ethan let out a bitter laugh. Gone? Just like that? Like I vanished into thin air? Like they erased you? His laughter died in his throat. Susan swallowed, rubbing her hands together, a nervous habit, a tremble she couldn't seem to control. I wasn't given details. They wouldn't tell me who adopted you, where you went. All I knew was that you had been placed in a home, and that was supposed to be enough. Ethan's breath was coming harder now, his mind racing. That's bullshit. It was the law. For the first time, her voice wasn't just breaking, it was shattering. I had no money, no resources. No one would tell me anything. I spent years trying to find out where you were, who took you in, but the system buried everything. Ethan felt his stomach twist violently. Because he knew what it was like to be lost in that system. The foster homes. The endless cycles of strangers pretending to care. The way the files got shuffled. The names changed, the past buried. She really might not have known. His vision blurred for a moment. He didn't want to believe her. Because if she was telling the truth, then everything he had built his life around was a lie. The anger, the resentment, the cold, unwavering hatred that had driven him, shaped him, made him the man he was today. What was left of him without it? Susan took a hesitant step forward, her voice quieter now. I know you hate me. Ethan's jaw clenched. Hate doesn't even begin to cover it. She nodded, accepting it. You have every right to. Silence stretched between them, thick with all the years they had lost. Then, carefully, cautiously, she whispered. But if you want the truth, if you want to know everything, her voice wavered. I'll tell you. I'll tell you everything I know, everything I remember. No excuses. No lies. Ethan exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair. He had spent his entire life convinced that she didn't deserve another chance. But now he wasn't so sure. Ethan sat in the corner booth of the now-empty diner, staring at the cup of coffee that had long gone cold in front of him. Across from him, Susan sat with her hands wrapped around her own cup, as if the warmth could stop the trembling. She told him everything. How she had been 17, working 2 jobs just to survive. How she had no family, no one to turn to. How the pregnancy had nearly killed her. How when he was born premature, his tiny body weak and fragile, the doctors told her the truth. If you keep him, he will die. You can't afford to save him. So she did what she thought she had to do. She sold the only thing she had, a part of herself. I thought if I just worked harder, if I could save enough, I could come back for you. But I was always one step behind. By the time I found the courage to ask, you were gone. Ethan sat still, his hands gripping the edges of the table so tightly his knuckles turned white. It wasn't fair. It wasn't supposed to be like this. I don't know what to do with this, he admitted, his voice low. Susan looked down, nodding slowly. I don't expect anything from you, Ethan. Her voice was tired, resigned. If all you wanted was to find me, to tell me to my face how much you hate me, then do it. I'll take it. I deserve it. Ethan's throat burned, because suddenly he wasn't so sure he could say the words. Outside, the city stretched out before him, cold, uncaring, endless. Ethan stood at the curb, staring at the diner, hands buried in his coat pockets. Susan hadn't followed him out. She had just let him go, because she knew in the end it was his choice. He could leave. He could walk away and never look back, let her fade into nothing.
Or
he pulled out his phone, staring at the screen for a long moment before finally sending the message to his assistant. Find her a place. Somewhere safe. Somewhere quiet. Seconds later, the reply came. How much should we spend? Ethan's lips pressed together. Doesn't matter. Make it good. A pause. Then another reply. And what about you, sir? Ethan turned, looking back at the diner one last time. The lights inside were dim now, the sign flickering weakly. He let out a breath, slow and measured, before finally typing his answer. I don't know yet. He slipped his phone back into his pocket and started walking. For the first time in years, he wasn't sure where he was going. But for the first time in years, he wasn't running anymore.